this tutorial series, we're going to create a true first-person setup where you can look down and see your feet and have lower body locomotion. You can have procedural weapon sway and procedural spine bending. So on his screen he can see all of it. It's all replicated and it has procedural aiming. And we might eventually get to recoil and some more advanced things and procedural lower body animations as well, and weapon swapping. So the first thing we're going to want to do is create our project. So I'm just going to start this off as a blueprint project. Let's call it True FPS Tutorial Create. And don't mind the map looking different. I just imported the the first person example map, so it's a little bit larger. Let's just delete this. This is annoying. And we're going to want to create our first C++ class. So open tools, new C++ class, create a character, call it True FPS Character, or whatever you want, of course. Make that public, and let's create class. This will take a while. And now that we've created our character class, let's add a component. So view property, and this will be a camera component. So let's just forward declare that. And in here, let's create the object. And while we're at it, let's remove the tick. We don't need that for now. And let's include the camera component. And let's attach it to our mesh. So essentially where the camera should be is it should be on our head for this true FPS setup. So, well, before that, we want to set it up so that it uses the pawn control rotation. So it's always facing where the controller is. And then we could set it up. Set up to the mesh and whatever your head socket name is. So in this case, mine is just head for the default mannequin that we're going to use in this. Now that we've got that set up, we can compile. Let's just create a new folder. And let's create a blueprint class derived from that. So get the true FPS character. And let's call this BP true FPS character. And you'll see that the camera has not actually been created, and that's because we need to restart the editor. So let's just do that really quick. Alright, now let's check our character. And as you can see, there's a camera now. So for our mesh, just set this to whatever. In this case, it'll be the mannequin. And the orientation of the camera is kind of strange, but I don't think that actually matters in game because it should orient to our control rotation. So what we're going to need to do in order to use this character is we're going to need a game mode. So let's make a game mode. And set the controller or the pawn to that new character we just created. And in the world settings, we can override that game mode with the game mode we just created. And if we play, yep, our character is in there. So that's good and all, but we can't actually move or do anything. So we're going to need to set up some basic inputs. So in the input section, let's add a few axis mappings. This will be move forward. And move right. Look up. And for some reason, looking up needs to be inverted. So. And look right. Alright. And in our character, we need to create a few functions. So, down here, let's just create another section for protected. Void move forward. Let's create definitions for all of these. Whoops. And for move forward, what we're going to do is get the direction. And to do that, we'll do F rotation matrix, F rotator, and get unit axis. And what this will do is it'll just use nothing but our yaw value in our control rotation, and we'll get a unit vector in that direction. And then we can use that to add movement input, direction, value. Yep. And do the same thing, similar for move right. But this time it'll be the y-axis, so the horizontal to where you're looking. And to look up, it'll be add controller pitch input value. I believe that's all we really need. Yep. And well, actually, before we compile, first we need to actually bind these functions. Let's just move that down. So, player input component, add action binding, bind axis actually. Whoops. Alright, now we can compile, and if that worked correctly, we should have basic locomotion. Alright, and look at that, we can walk and move around. You see this chin in our field of view. We'll eventually fix that, because that's no good, of course. And I don't like that we're just A-posing, so let's create really quick a animation blueprint for our character. And we'll just call it, well, should be assigned to the mannequin. And in here, for now, we're not really going to add anything except, let's see. Alright, so now, oh, of course we gotta assign it to our mesh. And you know, this camera's kind of bugging me. Not that it really matters, so let's just set the control rotation to world so it's not positioned so weirdly. It doesn't really matter though. Alright, and now we're in an actual tactical position, but obviously there's no inverse kinematics in the arms, but you know, that's the whole point of the tutorial, so we'll do that eventually. Alright, so next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a replicated weapon system with weapon swapping. So in order to do that, of course, we're going to need to make a weapon class. So let's create a class. And let's call it weapon. And you know, I'm going to move these into their own folders. And this is going to be an abstract class because we don't want to actually directly reference a weapon. We want only subclasses of this to exist in the game, so it's going to be derived from actor. Create the constructor. Actually, up here, well, yeah, protected. Let's give it a begin play. And let's give it a component. And, well, we're going to give it multiple components, actually. So, This component isn't completely necessary. We're just gonna add a root to this, a scene component, and you don't necessarily need this, but if you want an offset to your weapon that you might necessarily want to put as a separate transform or something, we could use this for some calculations later, but you don't need it, I don't think. So I'm just gonna call this root and another component. I can't type today. And this will be a skeletal mesh. This is going to be the actual weapon mesh. Oh, we need to do pragma once. Believe that should fix that. Yep. Let's create the constructor. We don't want this to tick, at least not yet. And call the super begin play. And we're going to want to create those components, so root, and let's set that to the root component, and then let's create the mesh. And I believe that's good enough. And in begin play, I think what we need to do, because what we're going to do is we're going to spawn the weapon on the server, okay? And we're going to have that replicate down to the client, and then if it is equipped, then it should be visible, but otherwise it should not. So in begin play, I believe we should make the mesh invisible, so set visibility false. And to make sure that it replicates, we need to set replicates true, so that when it is spawned in the server, it does replicate down. And I think that's also one other thing. We should create a struct. Make sure it's a blueprint type so we can access it in the animation graph. And this struct should be for our inverse kinematic properties, like the way the offset. You'll see. We don't necessarily need to complete everything. We might need to add more things later, but let's just create it. So FIK properties is what I'll call it, and give it a generated body. And for now, let's give it a few properties. So let's make all of these editable. And the first one we should do is we should let's see. So here what we need is we want a reference to an animation pose. This will be our base pose later, so anim sequence anim pose, that's what we'll call it. This will be our base pose for our inverse kinematics for this weapon, and then another U property, and this should be a float. aim offset. This will be the distance between our camera and the sights when we're aiming, and let's just set that to 15 for now. And here, let's see, this should be, let's make this a transform, and this should be our custom weapon offset transform. We don't necessarily need to set this to anything yet, so this will be the offset from our base pose to where we want the weapon to be. This isn't completely necessary, but we may implement this later. And let's add that in here, so that struct that we just made. And let's set the category to configurations. Let's just call it IK properties. Well, yeah, that's good enough for now. And another thing we should add here is a transform. And this should be a transform that, this transform, what it'll be is our offset when we grab it. So when we attach it to our mesh, we want it to be oriented a certain way, and we'll be able to configure this later. So let's call this placement transform. And I believe that's good enough for now. So in the character, let's just move all of this out of the way. This we'll add a U property, make it edit defaults anywhere, because we won't actually need to be able to edit this outside of the editor, or before outside of begin play, because this will only be affected at begin play, and this should be our default weapons. So we'll also add this to configurations, and this should be an array of classes of weapons. And let's call this default weapons. So during begin play, what we need to do is we need to get these default weapon classes and spawn them on the server, have them replicate down to the client, and then what we'll need to do is equip one of them. So in begin play, first thing we're going to do is check if we're the server. Begin play should be calling both client and server. Client, of course, if you're playing as a client. And we're going to need a for loop, and this should iterate over all of our weapons, default weapons. So weapon class, and iterates over all of our default weapons. And just a check here, so if the weapon class is not valid, then we will skip over that iteration. And here, before we spawn it, we're going to give it a few parameters. So factor spawn parameters, and we're going to set the owner to us, just so it can replicate properly, I believe. And we're going to get a reference to the weapon that we spawn. So a weapon, let's just call it spawned weapon, and we're going to get world spawn actor, and it'll be of type weapon, and make sure we spawn it from the weapon class and give it the params. And for now, it doesn't need any sort of transform. And then what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to make an array of weapons that will be replicated, so that we always have references to these spawned weapons. So in here we're gonna add a public section for this, and these will be replicated. This should be we shouldn't be able to edit this, so just visible, instance only, blueprint read write, and replicated, and we'll give it the category of state, and this will be an array of weapon references, and we'll call it the weapons. And in order to make sure that it is actually replicated, what we'll do is we will create another function. So up here we'll do virtual void get lifetime replicated props, I believe that's the syntax, and we'll add that function down here. Call the super function, and we're going to do rep lifetime condition. We need to include this, and it's going to pass a few arguments. We're going to pass in the character class. That's strange. Why is it giving an error? Move right. Did I delete something? True FPS character and the replicated item. And I don't actually think we'll need a condition for this, so just do condition none, and that should be good enough. So once we do that, we'll add that to our weapons array. So get the spawned, get the weapons, and add the spawned weapon. And I believe that should return an index reference, so let's get the index. And what we'll do is let's add another variable here. So this will be our index, our current index. So let's just call it current index, and we'll set it to 0 for now. So this should keep track of our index at all times when we're switching weapons locally. So we'll do this. If the index equals current index, meaning the one that we want to start out which should probably be in most cases 0. So the first weapon spawned, if it equals this index, then we will equip. So in order to equip it, what we'll have to do is we'll need another replicated variable. That's going to be a single weapon reference, and that's going to be our current weapon. So let's just write this out. And this is going to be a rep notify. So we'll do replicated using, and we'll call it the function onRep current weapon. And this should just be a single weapon reference. So we'll call it current weapon. And this should be giving us some red squigglies in a second, because we don't actually have this function. So let's just add a protected section down here. Give it a U function, and virtual void onRep current weapon. And let's pass in an argument of old weapon, so that old weapon. So when we switch weapons, this should be our old weapon reference, and when this replicates down, we'll also have the current weapon as well. So we can run logic on both. So if the index equals current index, then we will set that weapon, which is the spawned weapon, to the current weapon. So current weapon equals spawned weapon. And on the server, the onRep function won't be called by default, so we're going to have to manually call it. So it should be onRep current weapon right afterwards. And our old weapon will be none because we didn't have one previously. So now let's implement our onRep current weapon. So let's do that down here. onRep current weapon. So let's do if current weapon, because sometimes we may want to replicate nothing if we don't want to equip something, and if old weapon. So if we have our current weapon, what we'll need to do first is, well, actually, let's add one more section in here, one more variable. So in the public section, just put it above these other variables. This should actually be a state, and this will be our reference to our current owner, which is the true FPS character, and let's just call it current owner. So when the weapon's equipped, or not necessarily even equipped, but if it's in a character's inventory, it will have the reference to the owner. But of course we need to initialize that. So if current weapon current owner. If there is no current owner in the current weapon, then we're going to want to run some logic when equipped. So what we will need to do is actually attach it to the character. So in order to do that, we'll have to run some logic. So current weapon attach actor, well, it should just be attached to component, I believe. Yep, attached to component. And what we're going to attach to is we're going to attach to our mesh's hand socket. And if you don't have one, you should create a hand socket or a grab socket or something. Let's get the mannequin. And in here, you'll see connected to my hand, I have this weapon socket, and this is where the weapon should be placed. So we're gonna have to reference that. So it should be attached to the mesh. And for now, let's do f attachment transform rules keep world, so it remains the same location. And socket name is whatever your socket is. In my case, it's weapon socket R. And in order to make sure it's in the right location, we need to set the transform of the weapon. So current weapon set actor transform, and let's make the transform. It should be the mesh's socket. So get mesh, get socket, transform, and the weapon socket. And we'll also want to teleport it just in case you have physics on it for whatever reason. Just make it teleport physics or something, so it doesn't give you any weird errors. Oh. No sweep and no pointer here. And I believe that's good enough. Now if we go into our character, we'll see if it compiled correctly. We have a default weapons section, and we can add some weapons, but we didn't create any. So let's really quick. Let's just create a folder for this, weapons, and let's add a weapon. So derive it from the weapon class, and let's call this, I'm gonna make a rifle. So in the mesh, just make it whatever you want. This is a rifle mesh from the Weapon Silver Pack and the Unreal Marketplace. It's free, so you could just download that. And let's have that be one of our default weapons. And if everything worked correctly, it should be spawned on begin play. I don't think it'll be visible because we didn't write any logic for that, but we could just check that really quick. So if we go to here, and you'll see it actually is there, but it's invisible, so we need to fix that. So we should set the current weapons owner to us at the end of this, and we also are going to make the weapon visible. So get the mesh and set visibility true. Alright, I don't think that worked. Okay. Oh, right, of course. So the weapon isn't actually being replicated because we didn't actually set it to. So down here we need to create write the replication policy and everything. So character weapon, and it's not gonna have a condition, and I believe that should work now. Oh, whoops, not weapons, it should be current weapon. Okay, so the issue was I just needed to restart the editor, so and it should work. And now on the client, look at that, it's spawned. And should do the same as a server. If I play as a listen server, yep, everything's working. So now what we should do is we need to fix the orientation of the weapon, because obviously this isn't how you're supposed to hold a weapon, right? It should be placed in the hand. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of logic with that placement transform, and in the down here when we set its transform, let's just make this a separate variable over here. Placement transform. And in the placement transform, what we're going to do is we're going to get the socket, but we're also at first going to multiply it by the weapons placement transform. So get the current weapon and get the placement transform and multiply that. And, you know, obviously nothing's changed because we haven't set up the placement transform. So to do that, open your character. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to add a component. Add a skeletal mesh. And just set it to the rifle mesh or whatever your mesh is, and attach it to the socket. And you see this is the original transform we had. So now we just need to get the offset. So just move it around. Let's just, yep, move it around a bit until it's in the right orientation. That looks decent. Just move it a bit down. Alright, and with these values here, what we're going to do is open the weapon itself. And with this placement transform, just copy the location and copy the rotation in here. And I'm just gonna hide this, so visible. Let's set this to invisible for now. And let's check if that worked. Alright, and you'll see that the weapon's actually placed correctly now. So we could just delete this component. And now we've got the weapon spawning and replicating. So from that, let's add a little bit of weapon swapping logic. So to do that, open the project settings, go to input, and let's add a few action mappings. This will be next weapon, and this will be last weapon. Also, one other thing, make sure in the old weapon, if it's valid of course, just set its visibility to false. So that when we switch away from it, it's not visible. Alright, so in here, we'll do mouse wheel up. This will go to the next weapon, and mouse wheel down will go to the last weapon. So from that, let's create a few bindings. I'm going to make these virtual. Next weapon. Yeah, e-input event. Alright, now let's implement these functions. So, void and what we'll do here is essentially if we're switching weapons locally, then we need to well, I mean, obviously it will always be local, so we need to immediately switch weapons so that we don't feel any latency from having a round trip from calling the server and then swapping weapons. And we'll also need to call the server to swap weapons so that we're in sync with the server and it replicates down to everybody else. So we're going to also need to create a function here, and let's make it public. So let's do it up here. We want it to be blueprint callable. And let's call it equip weapon. And it's going to take in an index. So for equipping, let's add the logic here. And essentially, we'll do a check here. If we are locally controlled, then we want to swap weapons immediately. So we'll actually, yeah, current weapon equals, well, actually, before all of that, we need to check if the index is even valid. So weapons is valid index. If it's not a valid index, then we'll return. So none of the logic below will get run. If it is valid, however, then we can do, if it's locally controlled, then we're going to set the current weapon to the weapon index, and then we're going to call the onRep function. And we should first get a reference to the old weapon, so let's do and pass in the old weapon. Also, for locally controlled, we want to change the index to the index we passed in. So current index, and set that to index. Let's actually move that up here. And if we're not locally controlled, and we do not have authority, meaning we're the client, and we haven't already called this, then we'll need to run this logic as well. No, we'll need to, Okay, we'll need to run this logic, but we're gonna have to RPC it first. So we're gonna need to create another function up here. And this will be a server RPC, make it reliable. And we're gonna call it server set current weapon. And pass in the weapon reference. And create the implementation. And so in this case, we will call this, and we'll pass in the weapon. And then in the server set current weapon, we will do that here. So we need the old weapon, but we can just pass in weapon, set that to the current weapon. Let's call this new weapon actually, so that syntactically makes more sense. Also, something else we should do, we should also return if the current weapon equals the new weapon, because we don't want to be swapping to the same weapon over and over. Alright, now that we've got that down, we can run the logic for equipping the weapon with the scroll wheel. So for next weapon, we will just write equip weapon, and for the index, we're gonna have a little check here. Let's actually separate this out. So let's just check weapons is valid index, and it should be the current index plus 1. So if the next index is valid, then we're just gonna want to make that the index we're switching to, so current index plus 1. But if it's not, then it should be the 0th index, and we will equip that. For the last weapon, we're going to do the exact opposite. So for the index, it should be weapons.isValidIndex current index minus 1. And if that's valid, we're going to switch that index. Or if not, then we're going to get the last index. We want to swap to the last one. So weapons get is there a last index? Okay, so just num -1. So this will give us the actual index, and we equip that. All right, and let's see if that works. Okay, so we've got an error here. What's the error? Ah, um, oh, current weapon. Ah, okay, yeah, not current weapon, current index. Okay, now let's compile. Okay, and in order to check this, we're gonna have to create another weapon, something to switch between. So, weapon. I'm gonna make a shotgun, so BP shotgun. And this is also from the weapon silver pack. And so in the character, let's add that to our array. And let's see if that works. Okay, that's strange. Okay, so the issue here is for our current weapon, we're only doing it at setting it visible at the beginning. So we're actually gonna want to move it out, and whenever we equip it, we always want it to be set visible, and just the same way that we always set our old weapon to invisible. And in the weapon, the begin play is being called after we're setting it visible, so then it's setting it to default right after. So uh, in here, let's only do it if our current owner is not set. So this should only apply if it's our initial equipped weapon. And compile. And with that, our rifle's visible and our shotgun, and we could switch between them just like that. And as a server, we can do the same. So now that we've got weapon swapping and locomotion, in the next video we can tackle the animation blueprints and inverse kinematics and the control rig, and we'll finally start working on the actual true first person setup.